Our final speaker tonight is Shilpa Reddy. Shilpa's a doctoral candidate in sociology, where her interests are in the areas of gender, marriage and family, feminism, international development, and demography. Before coming to Maryland, Shilpa earned a master's degree in gender development and globalization at the London School of Economics. And she was a journalist for about 5 years in India, during which time she covered health, education, poverty, and development-related issues for leading newspapers in India. Tonight she's going to share work from her dissertation, which focuses on the impact of Indian women's labor force. Sorry, I said I would get this right. Indian women's labor force participation and earnings on their exposure to domestic violence. Thank you, Shilpa.
I should confess that one of the reasons I'm doing this talk is to overcome my fear of public speaking, so hence I need my notes in case I freeze. Okay, so I'm going to assume that everyone in this room feels safe at home. If you don't, you must do something about it. For most of us, our homes are a safe place. It is also a place where we can feel relaxed and comfortable, especially when we are in our bedrooms and on our beds. But now, I'd like you to close your eyes just for a few seconds and imagine a very different situation. Go ahead, you can close your eyes. Imagine a situation where being at home is scary because you fear a family member and you fear entering your bedroom or laying down on your bed. The fear is so intense that you feel safer on the dark, lonely streets outside than in your own home. And if you are a woman, imagine a situation where the person you fear the most in the world is your own husband. Not only because he gets angry, but because he hits you, rapes you, and may even kill you. You can open your eyes now. Thank you for doing that. So what we just imagined is a daily reality for millions of women across the world. In India, the country that I'm from and the country I'm studying, every 5 minutes, a case of domestic violence is reported. And every 77 minutes, a married woman is murdered or driven to suicide by her husband or her in-laws due to disputes over her dowry. And in the US, 1 in 4 women are victims of severe violence by an intimate partner. And every day, 3 women are murdered by a current or former intimate partner. And as we all know, there's severe underreporting when it comes to crimes such as domestic violence. So the real prevalence would be much higher than any statistic can possibly reveal. So what are we doing about it? In most developing countries, empowering women is seen as the solution to domestic violence. So the focus is on the victims, even though the problem clearly lies with the perpetrators. But that's a topic for another day. So the primary focus of these so-called women's empowerment programs is economic empowerment. So we help women become financially independent by helping them find a job or setting up a small business so that they do not have to tolerate domestic violence in return for economic support from their husbands or partners. But does economic independence really protect women from domestic abuse? This is a question that I attempt to answer with my research. In North America, it is possible that being financially independent can enable a woman to leave her abusive partner, at least to a large extent. But in India, survey data shows that it shows a very interesting paradox in the relationship between women's employment and domestic violence. So there we find that working women actually experience more violence than non-working women. So homemakers who don't earn anything at all actually experience the least amount of violence. So, and in addition, my research and many other studies have found that among working women, women who earn more than their husbands are more vulnerable to violence than those who earn less. This seems surprising, especially because you'd think that husbands would be happy if their wives earn a lot of money and contribute financially to the household. But we see the opposite in South Asia. So why is that the case? So this seemingly counterintuitive relationship between women's employment and domestic violence has been explained by what's called the backlash theory of abuse. So according to this, as women become more resourceful, men may resort to violence for instrumental reasons, to counteract the increased power gained by women in order to reinstate their dominance, and also because now there are more resources to extract from women. So in other words, in societies where the male breadwinner, female homemaker model is practiced widely, or in patriarchal societies, working women pose a threat to husbands, to the traditional gender norms, and to the patriarchy as a whole. So this does not mean at all that the solution to domestic violence is for women to stay at home and not enter the workforce or to quit their jobs. Though our research shows, my research and many others shows that working women experience more violence than non-working women, which is the bad news. The good news is that my research also shows that in communities where women's employment is more common, the levels of domestic violence are much lower. So, as you can see in this graph, the red line represents working women. So overall, while working women experience more violence than non-working women, that's the blue line, we see that as the female employment rates in the neighborhood increases, the levels of violence for both these groups go down. This could be because in communities where most women work, the working women are not really going against the norm or posing as much a threat to the traditional norms. Whereas in communities where women hardly work, the working women actually pose a threat. So what does this mean in terms of a solution? So while policies that encourage women's work are doing the right thing at the community level, these programs and initiatives should also address the increased risks that working women face. So these programs should include components that help women gain from employment without really placing themselves at greater risks. So my research so far examines all forms of domestic violence together, physical, sexual, and emotional violence. But my dissertation that I just started working on focuses on sexual violence in marriage and the laws surrounding it. Can any of you guess what is the punishment in India for a man who rapes his wife? Just a wild guess. That's right. So Indian law does not recognize marital rape as a crime, not just in India but in 35 other countries. So women who are raped by their husbands in India can only claim civil remedies under the domestic violence laws, and which is clearly inadequate to protect them from marital rape because it requires witnesses and evidence of rape. But most sexual violence in India happens within marriage. A recent study in India found that, this is based on survey research, found that 98% of sexual violence that Indian women face happens within marriage, where the husbands perpetrate the violence against wives, and only 2% is sexual. 2% of it is sexual violence that happens outside, where it's perpetrated by men who are not husbands, or it also includes strangers. And yet, it is this 2% that we all talk about, that the news media focuses on, and it's also the focus of citizens' outrage and all the protests, while we are mostly silent about the 98% of victims. So on one hand, rapes that happen on the streets in India make international headlines. Some of you may remember the brutal gang rape in 2012 that led to unprecedented protests and outrage, not just in India but also outside, and also unprecedented protests, and which led to subsequent changes in rape laws, not really marital rape laws. On the other hand, women who are raped in the private space of their bedrooms suffer in silence because marital rape is socially tolerated and accepted. So because rape within marriage is excluded from rape laws, a man can rape his wife and more or less get away with it. But if the same man rapes another woman who's not his wife, that act is considered a heinous crime with severe consequence, with severe punishment, which in some cases can also include the death penalty or lifelong imprisonment. So women's groups in India and feminist activists have been lobbying to criminalize marital rape, but the Indian government has argued time and again that the contract of marriage presupposes consent to sex, and that criminalizing marital rape will destabilize the institution of marriage, which is considered very sacred in the Indian context. So as part of my dissertation, I plan to interview women who are sexually abused by their husbands and find out if criminalizing marital rape would actually help them, or if the strong cultural norms will actually prevent them from reporting the crime to the police. And if they thought that it would still deter them, even if it would still deter their husbands from raping them, even if the women didn't report it to the police. So I hope my research contributes to the growing effort to criminalize marital rape in India. Getting rid of patriarchal and regressive laws is an important first step in changing cultural norms that oppress women. Economic empowerment of women, of course, has many benefits for the women, but it clearly doesn't seem to be protecting them from abuse at home. So most people who research topics such as mine have a personal story that motivates them. I was not a victim of domestic violence, or was I? It depends on how you define violence and consent. So my ex-husband, who I had an arranged marriage with and who was 11 years older to me, never hit me. He didn't even verbally abuse me. But he made me believe that if I do not have sex with him, it will end our marriage, and that will devastate both my family and his. So he complained to my mom that I refused to have sex with him, and my mom advised me that I should have sex with him, even if I didn't enjoy it. And she said that it was very important for women to provide sex to their husbands because men really need it to de-stress after a long day's work. So, and she said that even if it may hurt initially, but things will get better with time. So the thought of having my very first sexual encounter with a man whom I was so unhappily married to repulsed me, and it also scared me. But I did it because I feared being disowned by my parents and my family and my friends. For those who are unfamiliar with how marriage works in South Asia, let me tell you that marriage is almost universal in South Asia. Most marriages are arranged, and marriages are more a union of two families rather than of two individuals. And most relationships are unequal, with the man being older and having more power in the relationship. I'm yet to recover from the trauma of that single sexual experience with my ex-husband 14 years ago. It can be argued that that sexual encounter was consensual because he did not use force and I was a willing participant, or I appeared to be a willing participant. But is it really consensual when a woman or even a man willingly participates in sex only because he or she fears hurting or losing their loved ones? I will leave you with this question. This is something to think about in the era of the Me Too movement in the US that is redefining what sexual consent means. Thank you. I should take the finish time.
No, we have plenty of time.
Okay.
Yeah. Questions?
Thank you so much for sharing your story and centralizing yourself
interviews I'll probably be doing a year from now, so I didn't really think much about it, but I think it'll help them be more comfortable talking about their experience, even if their experience is much worse than mine. But yeah, I think that's something that will help the interviews.
I think for critical qualitative research, this is phenomenal and what you can contribute. Yeah. Excellent.
I hope I didn't depress you all.
No. This is amazing research.
I don't think depressed would be the right word.
I have one question. So for a lot of like social problems, sometimes people turn to use education or to turn their hope into next generation, because a lot of times a lot of issues coming from the culture, as you mentioned, the cultural norms, like from dates back to like 100 years ago. So have you find any efforts in India or like in the international societies try to start education programs in terms of the domestic violence? And everything?
So education helps while employment doesn't really seem to be helping a lot. So almost all research has found that those who are more educated experience less violence, whether it's the husband's or the wife's education. So so education really helps. And that is part of the efforts. But then most programs focus, so education, we encourage education for younger people, but for adults it's mostly employment.
So I have I'll say something first, and that's that I didn't look it up on my phone, but I'm fairly certain that marital rape only became illegal in America in my lifetime. And if you want to guess at how old I am, I'll tell you. But do you, it's recent, yeah. Like I think I remember. Do you, and this is asking a lot, to, probably the answer is no. Do you know if anyone is doing any kind of research to look at whether the pattern that you're talking about exists for Indian women outside of India? Like, does that,
So what exists?
does the same pattern of change depending on employment hold true for women, in Indian women in England or Indian women in
So like the
US?
Indian immigrants in the US?
Exactly. Yes, yeah.
Most Indian immigrants from the US, I think, are on the H1 visa, and their wives really don't, they're not allowed to work on that visa. So that's a really big issue, and there's a lot of research done on that. So most women are housewives here, but it's possible.
Yeah.
But probably if once they become citizens, I think they'll have more support of the laws here, and so there might be less abuse, but I'm not sure.
So the question I have is, doing something at the local level is where it needs to be done, but it seems to be very difficult if the conversation is only at the national level or at the local level, and there's always, quite often a disconnect between, there is agreement to, yes, we need to do this here, but when it comes to the local level here, how is that coming into your research to think about how you're going to impact, this issue?
So there's a strong belief that laws may not help much because culture is more important here. So, for instance, many believe that even if you criminalize marital rape, women are not going to report it to the police, so it really doesn't help. But in terms of how this research can impact policymakers, I'll have to do more than just my research. So, for instance, I am a fellow with the PRB, the Population Reference Bureau, that trains us in using our research to really make a difference. So that would involve, for instance, disseminating my work among the media, and also maybe create like dissemination workshops for policymakers and people working, for instance, in the Ministry of Home, and who make all these decisions, and the Ministry of Women and Child Welfare. So I shouldn't stop with the research, but do more than that, and I'm happy to do it.
So I hear that you talked a lot about working with the government, and it's rooted in culture. I think am I saying that correct? So is there a way, instead of working solely with the government or so much with the government, and working with more of the religious institutions to to try to impart some information there and maybe change some norms within the religious institution to permeate through the culture?
So the religious leaders do not have as much power in India as they do here, but they are one of, part of the audience. So, and like 85% of India are Hindus, so maybe Hindu religious leaders could be part of the process. But I think the main target for me would be politicians and the media, and yeah, I think it's mainly policymakers, members of parliament, because they have the real power. And the media would help, because if the media talks a lot about it, then people will come out of the streets and protest and things like that, and that would pressure the politicians to do something about it. That's what happened recently during the candidate in 2012. It was because of the protests that there was some change in terms of making the rape laws more strict or increasing the punishment for rapes.
So I'm sorry if I misunderstood, but you like want to talk to a lot of people, right? Like which you will do later. Like how will you get this data?
Oh, I plan to do the interviews myself.
Okay, I mean, I was curious to know that, like, the sample space, like the way you meet these people. And
I have contacts with some NGOs in India that.
Okay.
So, for instance, I work with one NGO in Bangalore that works with victims of domestic violence. So, I plan to recruit my interviewees.
But that is what I was thinking. So, if you're talking to NGOs, like, they will. I don't know. How will you draw this correlation? Like, educated people with education and marriage and all that, like work. So because all the NGOs that will not give you like very qualified women, I guess. I mean, I don't know.
Okay, so the two parts to the dissertation. One is the quantitative analysis, for which I will be using secondary data, that is the National Family Health Survey data, which is a large-scale, nationally representative survey that covers all the states. So that kind of analysis about the relationship between domestic violence and, say, education, employment, and all those women's resources would be part of the quantitative research. The qualitative would be more like selecting, say, one state, and that sample doesn't really have to be representative, but selecting, for instance, the state of Bihar, which has the highest domestic violence, and talking to them about their experiences more than drawing conclusions about education and things like that.
So I think I'm going to stop those questions there. And